Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit with my guest, Langston Kahn. Our topic for this session is Ancestral Healing as Resistance. Langston Kahn is a queer, Black shamanic practitioner specializing in radical transformation and freeing up emotions to be the wise teachers they are. He stands firmly at the crossroads, his practice informed by the Western modality of inner relationship focusing, initiations into traditions of the African diaspora, the contemporary shamanic traditions of the Last Mask Center, and the guidance of his helping spirits and ancestors, weaving it all together. Langston, it is such a delight to be with you today. Welcome.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. You've got a lot of interesting things to say. So let's go ahead and dive right in. For many peoples of the African diaspora, the idea of ancestors is understandably both a source of strength and of deep pain and grief. And I'm wondering, how can they connect to the medicine of those who came before them?
That's a really good question. I think part of teasing out the answer to that question starts with a definition of ancestors, in a sense, or how I define ancestors, as differentiated just from unresolved dead people or ghosts, as in popular terminology. So what I think distinguishes those energies first and foremost is that from a shamanic perspective, ancestors are the beings that happen or that occur when humans have lived a life well, and then they've died well, and they've been supported in their transition to move into the ancestral realms, so that they then can be called back if they choose to and come and be true ancestor helping spirits that are supporting the living and sharing their wisdom. So we're not constantly starting from scratch. We have access to this lineage of continuity. And in many indigenous cultures, there's a lot of practices to ensure that that continuity is being maintained and the dead are being honored and helped along if they maybe didn't live such a good life, or maybe they had or died in an unexpected or tragic way, so that they still can get to where they need to go, reconcile their life, and then show up as a true helper, in a sense. And so what we're dealing with, or many of us in the contemporary world, and especially those of us from the African diaspora, are dealing with, is many dead people who are unresolved because they have not had their deaths tended well or died in tragic circumstances. And I think when we're starting to tune into our ancestors and we're feeling the overwhelm of pain or trauma or suffering, a lot of times that's not because that's just an inevitable part of ancestral work, but because we have a number of our beloved dead that need support in fully moving on. They're still kind of here among the living. And in my experience, when the dead are with the living, when they aren't true ancestors, it's actually harmful for the living. There is that feeling of emotional overwhelm associated with it. There can be the illnesses of much older people being manifested in much younger people. And there's also, really the worst part of it is that there's ways that patterns that those people in their life weren't able to resolve, they continue to try to live out and resolve through their living descendants. So we feel sort of stuck in these beliefs that we know aren't actually true, but that feel so much like our reality, we can't really step out of them. It's like when you're sitting down and you want to make that new choice, but you do the old choice anyway, even though you know that the new choice would be better for you. That feeling of this wave that just keeps overtaking you is often related to this energy of the unresolved dead. And so I think once we begin to tease out the unresolved dead from true ancestors, then we can begin to understand how to start connecting to our people. And what we start with then is calling out for those good, true, and beautiful ancestors, those luminous ones who truly have transitioned, sort of reaching over that big pile of unresolved dead that for many of us is in our lines, and starting to allow ourselves to be resourced by the love that is there waiting for us.
Right. It sounds like it could be so very, very complicated. I know a lot of people who do ancestral healing, they sort of depend on their ancestry.com page, their genealogy tree. And I know that a lot of people who are descended from slaves, etc., they just don't have access to that kind of thing. So it can be a little difficult. So I'm wondering, how did you start this? Can you share a bit about your own ancestry and how you got into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So my ancestry is on my mother's side. We do descend from peoples that were enslaved. My mother is African American, and we can't trace back because of slave records what actual countries we are from. And due to genetic testing and some of my own sort of confirmation from my ancestors, I know that we are Nigerian and Malian as well, but I don't know exactly where from. And also some Scottish and Jewish ancestry on that side, partly due to the legacy of slavery and colonization, like overseers, raping other people. So additionally, on my father's side, he is German Jewish and Swiss primarily. And so already, just for me, part of my process as a person of many different ethnicities and ancestries, there's some difficulty in teasing out the conflict of having ancestry of people that were both oppressors and oppressed, in a sense. Now, I don't think that's only unique to people of the African diaspora, because even if you look at some of the bigger cultural troubles like sexism, a lot of us have legacies of men who are very harmful to women that are both our ancestors, or many other types of ways that people were both oppressor and oppressed. So I don't want to get too sidetracked there, but essentially, I guess, to answer more about how I began to connect without that access, it was a combination of both magic, in a sense, and also just the desire to show up. And so the magic part of it was I had actually no information, or very little information I knew about on my mother's side, and actually even less information on my father's side. Even though that didn't have anything to do with slave records, he just hadn't really kept up with a lot of that knowledge, in a sense. And so what happened was I was at this ritual with part of a spiritual community I belonged to at the time, and a medium had my grandmother embodied through them. And the first thing she said to me when she came, sort of spontaneously, was, "Don't believe everything you've heard about me." And the medium didn't know this, but at the time, I had mostly heard kind of stories that were really negative about her, because she had a very difficult relationship with some of my family members, and because she's a very brilliant person that also had a lot of other flaws, as many very brilliant people do. And so it was very interesting to me to right off the bat say, okay, the narrative you have isn't complete. Let me help correct this. And within a week of that ritual, my parents called me and said they found a letter from her written to me saying, for Langston, when he writes his book, and it detailed 7 generations of these ancestors that I had no idea about, that we didn't have their names, their dates, and little anecdotes about them. And so it felt like the moment I stepped into relationship and started trying to connect, even though it seemed impossible, suddenly the ancestors are right there reaching back to me. And I think that's what a lot of people will find. And then, of course, after that, for me, I also engaged in a lot of work with Christina Pratt, who runs the Last Mass Center, and working on her process for healing the ancestral lines and training that technique and doing that work with my ancestors. And I also did a work with Daniel Forrest's process, and also in Lukumi, Reuben practices, and in Kimbanda and Afro-Brazilian practice as well, doing a lot of work with my ancestors. And part of that's just because I'm a person who, that's a big part of my medicine and a big part of where my heart is, the ancestors. But each of those traditions and perspectives helped me begin to patch together this restoration of a lineage that had been sundered, in a sense. And so I think for anyone who maybe doesn't have access to a teacher or a tradition right away, it can be really helpful just to be willing to state that intent out loud and start to make a little time in your life, or a little space in your life for that connection. And often when we do that, the ancestors are just waiting for any opportunity where they can jump in and start showing up as well.
Yeah, I love that story about your grandmother and the letter. I've had my own versions of, not quite that dramatic, but I see what you're saying, where sometimes when you state the intent, even if it's just in your own head, just suddenly, blammo, you receive information that up until then just wasn't available. So I'm glad that you brought that up, just to let people know that that absolutely can happen. What a great story.